Welcome to my channel. My name is Antonio Yerbasoni. I'm a Peruvian composer and university professor, and this is the 6th video in my series on orchestration, which aims to introduce you to some key aspects of this wonderful art. In this video, I'll discuss the most common cases that come up when orchestrating piano works. I often tell my students that orchestration is similar to translation, in that it's essentially the idiomatic conversion of music written for one instrument into the language of another. Orchestrators usually start from one piece for a single instrument or a small ensemble, and during their formative years, almost exclusively from works for piano. Since the original pieces are always adapted to the techniques of the instruments involved, turning those pieces into orchestral works requires making some adjustments. However, orchestration differs from arrangements in that an arrangement is a free adaptation, while an orchestration aims to preserve as much of the original character of the piece as possible. Nevertheless, some minor adjustments must be made, as the techniques for the instruments differ from each other. When it comes to piano solo pieces, there are some typical problems that many students don't know how to deal with. I'll present the most common ones and give examples of how they can be solved. Voice leading in piano works is different from that of the orchestra. The uniformity of the piano's timbre makes it difficult to track the internal voices in a chord progression, giving the composer some flexibility. Among other things, it's possible, for example, to reduce or increase the number of voices without this being obvious. On the other hand, the piano technique is subject to the physiological and mechanical limitations of the hand. A very common case is when very short passing notes appear isolated, without any harmonization, as in this example. This doesn't necessarily mean that the composer wanted the other voices to stop when those passing notes appear. Rather, it's usually due to the fact that interrupting the harmonization, which is imperceptible, makes it easier to play the passage. So, instead of interrupting the voices in the orchestration, maybe they should be sustained, at least where it's obvious that that is what the composer wanted, which is of course a matter of interpretation. Examples abound in piano music where one hand plays a melody while the other plays an isorhythmic accompaniment that develops the harmony. One of these accompaniments, the Alberti bass, typical of the classical period, is based on a repeating pattern that presents the notes of the chord. It's very comfortable for a pianist, who uses a slight twist of the wrist to facilitate playing. On other instruments, however, it requires more effort. For example, on cellos it's possible, but the notes must be fingered thoroughly. While on the piano it sounds natural and relaxed, on the cellos it can sound somewhat forced. Speed is crucial in this regard. In the example just given, the accompaniment is simply too fast. Also, this accompaniment often places the third of the chord in a very low register, and the spacing is poor, with a large gap between the melody and the accompaniment. The solution would then be to do something like this, which distributes the accompaniment notes between the instruments and is more suitable for them than the Alberti bass. Another typical type of piano accompaniment is arpeggios, as in this example. A solution in this case could be perhaps something like this. Yes, the arpeggios have been changed to something different, but there's no other alternative. This is the closest thing to the original accompaniment that instruments can comfortably play in the orchestra. Furthermore, the accompaniment is a secondary element in this musical fragment. It's very common to find passages of music for piano in which the melody and the accompaniment are fused in the part of the right hand, in a similar way to what happens in the Alberti bass, in which the accompaniment and the bass line are also fused together. Look at this example of a piece by Peruvian composer Manuel Aguirre. In it, the melody and the accompaniment are combined in the right hand. Can you make out the melody? It's not this, but this. In the orchestra, the solution would then be to do something like this. In piano scores, accents are indicated by the traditional symbol, or a sforzando mark, like in this fragment. In orchestral scores, on the other hand, they can be omitted, and the accent can be performed by an instrument or group of instruments that enters briefly. Percussion is very often used to accomplish this. One can also do both at the same time, that is, write the accent in the normal way and add instruments reinforcing at the same time, as in this example. Sometimes piano scores have very little dynamics, which has several different explanations. One, the work is very old, from the Baroque period, for example. Two, the composer preferred to place only some explicit dynamics and leave the rest to the performer's discretion. And 3, it's not always necessary to write a lot of dynamics. The character of the music, the direction of the phrase, and other variables may suggest them. Writing dynamics in a solo piano work is not a necessity because, ultimately, the musician can make decisions about them at the very moment of performance. In the orchestra, however, it's necessary to be as specific as possible since it's formed by a large number of musicians who cannot anticipate or foresee what others will do. Nevertheless, the lack of dynamics in the original work doesn't mean that the orchestrator is free to do what he or she wants. The title of the work, the character of the music, the style, the tempo, and specific characteristics of the different passages such as the register, the melodic direction, the number of simultaneous notes, the articulations, etc., will inform him about the appropriate dynamics. Slight modifications are possible, such as adding hairpins. It's also possible to slightly modify the specific place where a dynamic occurs, indicate a greater or lesser dynamic, write a final dynamic for a crescendo that has no dynamic in the score, and so on. But whatever we do, it must always be consistent with the character of the original work. Very long slurs are quite common in piano works. These cannot be transcribed in the orchestration because not all instruments can produce them. The problem is not reduced to whether we are asking the musicians for something impossible because, in the end, when the bow or the air runs out, they'll have no choice but to change direction or cut the slur to breathe. Rather, it's about anticipating this and preventing the rehearsal from constantly being interrupted. We must start from the slurs in the original work to write those of the orchestral version, since they contain important information about how the work should sound. If it's possible to keep them, we do it. If not, we change them. But even if they are possible, we can always make small modifications if we think the result will be better. Another articulation that is sometimes scarce in piano scores is staccato, as it is sometimes redundant. A group of fast and short repeated notes, for example, cannot be played in any other way. However, the same on a violin or flute will sound different. In the past, editors avoided marking the staccato if it was evident that the passage could not be performed otherwise. This saved several hours of work, since scores were made by engraving metal plates. Orchestrating a piano work featuring these characteristics requires placing the staccato where it's needed. Otherwise, the work will sound different. In addition, today the placement of this articulation is a very simple thing to do. Due to the effect of the sustain pedal, an accompaniment in the left hand sounds as if each of the alternately played notes has a longer duration. Therefore, certain notes must be written with longer values in the orchestration to give a pedal-like effect. A first option would be to distribute the notes among different groups, as seen in this example. It's also possible to give the entire line to an instrument or group of instruments, while others sustain the harmony, as shown here. A piano chord where the hands are far apart may sound good, as the space between them will be filled with the resonance of the instrument. However, the same distribution of the notes in the orchestra will not be as effective. Also, if the left-hand chord is in close harmony, something very common in pieces from the classical period, transcribing the exact notes to the orchestra will produce very small intervals in the low register, which doesn't sound good in certain styles of music. In general, it's best to distribute the notes by imitating the arrangement of the harmonic series, that is, with larger intervals in the low register. However, if the lowest note is near the middle octave, this is not absolutely necessary. Also, in piano music, chords are often written with arpeggio lines or grace notes. Sometimes this is an ornamental effect desired by the composer, but other times it's because the chords are too wide. It's necessary to learn to identify when this occurs due to a physical limitation, and in those cases, write the chord in the orchestra as notes that must be played simultaneously. If the ornament is desired, it can be produced with multiple stops on the strings or a harp arpeggio. Tremolos, also known as shakes, are very common in piano works, especially in octaves, which occur due to the difficulty in producing repeated notes of very short values on the instrument. In the orchestra, on the other hand, there are no instruments capable of playing fast octave tremolos, except instruments such as a xylophone or a keyboard. So these must be translated as what the composer surely wanted to write but couldn't: repeated short notes. It's also common to find tremolos to sustain the harmony in piano works, especially from the Romantic period. There are different ways to translate them into an orchestration. The first would obviously be to replace the tremolo with long notes, but this will remove the unstable character of the tremolo and replace it with a stable one, which is not bad if the result corresponds better to the character of the work. A second solution is to transfer the tremolo to the orchestra, which on the strings can be done in two ways, bow tremolo or left-hand tremolo. The former allows better control of dynamics, the latter produces a smoother result. Finally, it's also possible to combine the two solutions, that is, to write long notes on several instruments and tremolos on others, or only on one, for example on the timpani. Since piano technique is subject to the physiological and mechanical limitations of the hand, writing an orchestration of a piece originally for piano requires making some adjustments. A passage that sounds natural and relaxed on the piano may sound forced on other instruments, or even be impossible to play. The goal of the orchestrator should be to write a solution that is as close to the original music as possible. Voice leading is of greater importance in the orchestra than it is on the piano. Accompaniments can be completely rethought, as they are often secondary elements in original works, and if there are any merged parts, they must be separated in the orchestration. Accents can be played by an instrument or group of instruments entering briefly. The sustained pedal effect must be created in the orchestration, and the note distribution in the chords must be reworked. Some indications that are lacking in the original, such as dynamics and articulations, must be thought through carefully and explicitly written in the orchestrations. Musicians can't read each other's minds. Thank you for watching this video, and subscribe to be notified when I post a new one. I give private lessons online on orchestration. If you want to know more, click on the linked video or visit my website. The link is in the description below.